I reached for the wire snare hanging from the low birch branch, already knowing from the way it dangled that I'd come up empty again. 3 days running now with nothing to show for my efforts. The rabbits had either moved on to better feeding grounds or learned to avoid my usual spots. 23 years I'd been working these woods, and the patterns here made sense to me in ways that most people couldn't understand. Where the deer came to drink at dawn, which clearings the turkeys favored for dust baths, how the weather changed, the way small game moved through the underbrush. My property stretched for 47 acres of mixed hardwood forest, and I knew every fallen log, every rock formation, every game trail that crisscrossed through the trees. The empty snare went back into my canvas bag with the others. 6 traps checked, all clean. Tomorrow I'd move them to the south ridge where I'd spotted fresh droppings earlier in the week. Waste of time to keep checking the same spots when the animals had clearly found new territory. I turned back toward the cabin, following the path I'd worn down over the years. My boots knew every root and stone along this route, even in the growing darkness. The familiar weight of the .30-30 rifle slung across my shoulder felt comfortable against my back. Not that I expected trouble, but 47 years of living had taught me that being prepared saved more problems than it caused. Something red blinked through the trees ahead, off to my left near the old oak grove. I stopped walking. Nothing in these woods blinked red. Nothing at all. The light pulsed again, steady as a heartbeat, coming from somewhere up in the branches about 30 yards away. I unslung the rifle and approached slowly, keeping my footsteps quiet on the carpet of dead leaves. Whatever was making that light didn't belong here. The object came into view as I got closer, a strange mechanical thing caught in the lower branches of the biggest oak, maybe 8 feet off the ground. It looked like someone had attached 4 small propellers to a flat gray body about the size of a hardcover book. Wires ran along its surface in patterns that made no sense to me, and underneath hung what looked like a tiny camera in a clear plastic housing. I'd heard them mention these things on the radio during the evening news. Drones, they called them. Flying machines that people used for taking pictures or delivering packages. City folks used them for entertainment, from what I could gather. Never thought I'd see one way out here. This one had clearly met its match with the oak tree. 2 of the propellers hung bent and twisted, and a crack ran down one side of the main body. The red light kept blinking from somewhere inside the damaged casing, probably a battery indicator of some kind. I leaned the rifle against the trunk and grabbed onto the lowest branch, pulling myself up high enough to reach the machine. It weighed less than I expected, maybe 2 pounds at most. The plastic felt smooth and foreign under my fingers, nothing like the wood and metal tools I was used to handling. Whoever built this thing had packed a lot of complicated parts into a small space. The camera housing had taken a beating from the impact. The clear cover was cracked, and the lens itself looked crooked inside its mounting. But the red light kept pulsing, which meant something inside was still working. I climbed back down and held the device up to catch the last bit of daylight filtering through the canopy. The construction was precise in a way that impressed me, even damaged as it was. Every screw, every wire, every joint showed careful engineering. This wasn't some toy put together in someone's garage. Professional work, expensive work. But what was it doing way out here? My nearest neighbor lived 6 miles away, and they were old-timers like me who wouldn't know a drone from a toaster oven. The closest town sat another 12 miles beyond that, full of farmers and loggers who had better things to spend their money on than flying cameras. I turned the machine over in my hands, looking for any kind of marking or label that might explain where it came from. The only writing I could find was tiny serial numbers molded into the plastic, too small to read in the fading light. The walk back to the cabin took longer than usual. I kept stopping to examine the drone more closely, trying to understand how the various parts connected together. The propellers attached to small electric motors. That much I could figure out. And the camera obviously served some purpose related to taking pictures. but the maze of wires and the various small components scattered across the surface remained a mystery. My cabin sat in a small clearing I'd carved out of the forest 15 years ago. One room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping area, and a kitchen that consisted of a wood-burning stove and some shelves. Simple living, but it suited me fine. I'd built the place myself using timber from my own land, and it felt more like home than any house I'd ever lived in. I set the drone down on my workbench next to the window, where I kept my hand tools and spare parts for maintaining my generator and radio equipment. The red light continued its steady blinking, casting weird patterns on the rough wood surface. After lighting the oil lamp, I pulled up my wooden stool and really started examining the machine. The camera housing drew my attention first. It was more sophisticated than any camera I'd ever seen, with multiple lenses arranged in some kind of array. The crack in the plastic cover looked like it went all the way through, but I couldn't tell if the damage had affected the actual camera components inside. I traced the wires with my finger, following their paths across the device's surface. Some led to the motors, others disappeared into the main body through tiny holes. The whole thing ran on electricity, obviously, but I couldn't see any way to plug it into a wall socket. Had to be battery-powered, which explained why it was still blinking even after crashing into the tree. The engineering impressed me more the longer I looked at it. Whoever designed this had solved dozens of small problems I'd never even considered. How do you make something that flies but weighs almost nothing? How do you control it from far away? How do you keep a camera steady while it's bouncing around in the air? I'd always been good with mechanical things. Had to be, living this far from town. When my generator broke down or my radio stopped working, I either fixed it myself or did without. Over the years, I'd gotten pretty skilled at taking things apart and figuring out how they worked, but this drone represented a level of complexity that was completely new to me. The metal casing felt warm to the touch near where the red light blinked. Something inside was definitely still active, drawing power from whatever battery system kept it running. I wondered how long it would continue working before the power ran out completely. I set down my tools and just sat there looking at the machine in the lamplight. In all my years in these woods, nothing like this had ever shown up on my property. The most modern thing I owned was my battery-powered radio, and that was already 10 years old. This drone represented a world of technology that felt completely separate from my daily life. But here it was, sitting on my workbench like some kind of messenger from the outside world. And despite my usual wariness of complicated gadgets, I found myself genuinely curious about what it might tell me if I could figure out how to make it work. I turned the drone over in my hands for what felt like the 100th time, running my thumb along the cracked plastic where it had hit the oak tree. 3 days now I'd been picking at this thing, trying to understand how all the pieces worked together. The red light had finally stopped blinking yesterday morning, battery finally giving up, but I'd gotten curious enough by then to keep going. My tool collection wasn't exactly designed for electronics work. Most of what I owned was built for fixing generators, radios, and the occasional engine trouble, but I'd learned over the years that if you were patient and careful, you could adapt almost any tool to almost any job. I'd used a thin screwdriver to carefully pry apart the camera housing, working slowly to avoid damaging whatever was inside. The first day had been mostly just looking. I'd spread out a clean cloth on my workbench and laid out each piece as I removed it, trying to keep track of how everything connected. The camera assembly was more complex than I'd expected. Multiple lenses arranged in some kind of array, all connected to a circuit board covered in components too small for me to identify. The second day I'd focused on the wiring, following each connection from the camera back to the main body, mapping out how the signals traveled from one part to another. Some wires I recognized, power connections that looked similar to what I used in my radio equipment. Others carried signals I couldn't begin to understand. But it was on the third day, when I'd carefully lifted out the main circuit board, that I found the small rectangular card tucked underneath. About the size of my thumbnail and thinner than a dime, it had tiny metal contacts along one edge and what looked like a brand name stamped into the plastic. Memory card. Had to be. The kind of thing that stored pictures in digital cameras. I'd heard about these on the radio broadcasts, though I'd never actually seen one before. People used them to save photographs and videos in their electronic devices. If this drone had been taking pictures when it crashed, those images would be stored on this little card. The problem was figuring out how to look at what was on it. My battery-powered radio was the most sophisticated electronic device I owned, but it was built for receiving signals, not for displaying pictures. Still, it had more connection ports than most radios, including some inputs I'd never bothered to use. I spent most of the afternoon with my magnifying glass, studying the ports on the radio and comparing them to the connectors I'd pulled out of the drone. Nothing matched directly, but I'd solved bigger problems with less. I had a collection of cables and adapters from various pieces of equipment I'd owned over the years. Radio antennas, power cords, audio connections, all kinds of wire and plugs that I'd kept because you never knew when they might come in handy. I started by fashioning a crude adapter from a broken headphone jack and some thin wire I'd stripped from an old extension cord. The memory card reader from the drone needed power, and the radio could provide that through one of its auxiliary inputs. Getting the signal connections right took longer, but I'd worked with enough radio equipment to understand the basics of how electronic signals moved through wires. By evening, I had a rat's nest of cables and adapters connecting the memory card reader to my radio. It looked like something a kid might build for a science fair project, but when I powered everything on, the connections held. More importantly, the radio's display, a small screen I'd barely noticed in all the years I'd owned the device, suddenly showed something other than frequency numbers. The screen was maybe 2 inches across and built for showing simple information like station names or song titles. But apparently it could display other things too, because when I finally got the card reader working, grainy images started appearing on that little screen. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. The picture quality was poor, compressed down to fit on a display never meant for showing photographs. Dark shapes against a lighter background. Everything blurry and hard to identify. I pressed the controls on the radio, trying to figure out how to navigate through whatever was stored on the card. Then the image changed, and I felt my stomach drop. A person, definitely a person, being pulled across what looked like forest floor. The body was limp, arms trailing behind, and whoever was doing the dragging wasn't visible in the frame. Just those lifeless limbs bouncing over roots and dead leaves, leaving a clear trail through the dirt. I stopped breathing for a moment, staring at that tiny screen. Then I found the button that moved to the next image, and the next one made me step back from the workbench. A man's face filled the screen, mouth open wide in what had to be a scream. His eyes were huge with terror, looking directly into the camera. The angle was wrong somehow, like the drone had been falling or spinning when it captured the image. Behind the man's head, I could see trees and underbrush that looked familiar. My hands started shaking as I pressed the button again. The screen went black for a second, then showed something that made me grab the edge of the workbench to steady myself. An eye, massive, easily the size of a dinner plate, peering directly into the camera lens. The pupil was huge and black, surrounded by an iris that seemed to shift colors even in the poor quality of the display. But it was definitely looking at the camera, looking with an intelligence that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever seen. Then the image cut to black and stayed that way. I stood there for a long time, staring at the blank screen. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and my mouth had gone completely dry. I pressed the navigation button again, cycling back through the images. The dragging scene, the terrified face, that enormous eye. Each time I looked, the details became clearer and more disturbing. The timestamp in the corner of each image showed dates and times. The footage had been recorded just 2 days before I found the drone crashed in the oak tree. Whatever had happened to that man, it had happened recently, and close enough to my property that the drone had been able to record it before crashing. I recognized some of the terrain in the background of the dragging scene. The particular arrangement of moss-covered rocks, The way the trees grew in that area, I'd walked past that spot dozens of times over the years. It was definitely somewhere on my land, probably near the creek bed that ran along my eastern border. I cycled through the images a third time, forcing myself to look carefully at each one. The man in the footage was young, maybe 30 years old, with dark hair and wearing what looked like hiking clothes. Someone who might have been camping or exploring in the area, the kind of person who wouldn't know about the game trails or the safe routes through the forest. But what had gotten him? That eye didn't belong to any animal I knew. Too big, too aware, too wrong. Bears lived in these woods along with deer, coyotes, and smaller game. I'd seen tracks from all of them, knew their habits and behaviors. Nothing I'd ever encountered could produce an eye that size. I turned off the radio and sat down heavily on my wooden stool. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, the walls too thin. I'd always felt completely safe in these woods, confident that I understood every danger they contained, knew which plants were poisonous, which areas flooded during heavy rain, where the unstable ground might give way under your feet. But I'd never known about this. Something was hunting in my forest, something big enough and strong enough to drag a grown man through the underbrush, something intelligent enough to look directly into a camera before destroying it. And based on the timestamp of that footage, it had been doing its hunting just 2 days ago, probably while I was checking my rabbit snares less than a mile away. I looked down at the memory card sitting on my workbench, such a small thing to contain such disturbing information. Part of me wanted to destroy it, pretend I'd never seen what it showed, go back to my simple routine of trapping and hunting and maintaining my equipment. But I knew every inch of these woods, had walked every trail, and explored every clearing during my 23 years here. If something this dangerous was living on my property, I needed to know where. I pulled on my boots and checked the rifle one more time, making sure the magazine was full and the safety was on. The memory card sat in my shirt pocket, a tiny reminder of what I'd seen on that grainy screen the night before. Sleep hadn't come easy after viewing those images, and when dawn broke, I was already dressed and ready to move. The eastern creek bed would be my starting point. I'd recognized enough landmarks in the footage to know the general area where that man had been dragged through the forest. 23 years of walking these woods gave me an advantage most people wouldn't have. I could match terrain features from the video to actual locations on my property. I followed the creek downstream, letting the sound of running water guide my path while I scanned the surrounding forest for anything that matched what I'd seen on the screen. The rifle felt heavier than usual, slung across my shoulder, weighted down by the knowledge of what might be lurking somewhere in these trees. After about an hour of walking, I started seeing familiar rock formations and tree arrangements that matched the background details from the dragging footage. The drone had captured specific angles and perspectives that I could now identify from ground level. A fallen birch tree with its distinctive white bark, a cluster of moss-covered boulders, the way the undergrowth thinned out near a small clearing. I was getting close. The disturbed earth showed up first, a patch of ground where something heavy had been pulled across the dirt, leaving scraped furrows and broken vegetation. I knelt down to examine the marks more carefully. The impressions were deep enough to indicate significant weight, and the pattern suggested something being dragged rather than walked. Dark stains marked the soil in several places. I didn't need to touch them to know what they were. Blood had soaked into the dirt and turned black over the past few days, but the metallic smell still lingered in the air. More than just drops or spatters. This was where someone had bled heavily. The trail led away from the creek bed and deeper into the woods, marked by broken branches, disturbed leaves, and more of those dark stains. I followed it carefully, rifle ready, matching each step to the path of destruction I could see laid out in front of me. Whatever had done the dragging hadn't bothered to hide its route. The blood trail stretched for maybe 100 yards before reaching a rock formation I'd passed countless times over the years. Granite outcroppings jutted up from the forest floor, creating natural walls and overhangs that I'd always assumed were solid stone. But now, following the trail around to the backside of the rocks, I found thick brush and fallen logs arranged in a way that looked almost deliberate. Behind the brush was an opening. I'd walked past this spot dozens of times and never noticed the cave entrance. The logs had been positioned to block the view from most angles, and the undergrowth had grown up around them to create natural camouflage. Only someone following a direct path from the blood trail would have found it. The metallic smell of blood grew stronger as I approached the opening. Something else mixed with it, a musky animal odor that reminded me of wet fur and rotting meat. I'd smelled similar scents around bear dens and coyote kills, but this was different. Stronger, wrong in ways I couldn't identify. I clicked off the rifle's safety and pulled out my flashlight. The cave entrance was larger than it appeared from outside, easily big enough for a person to walk through without ducking. The beam of my light penetrated maybe 20 feet into the darkness before hitting what looked like a turn or branching passage. The smell hit me full force as I stepped inside. Death and decay, layered with something else that made my stomach turn. The floor of the cave was uneven stone, worn smooth by water over countless years, but scattered across that stone were things that made me stop breathing. Bones, human bones, picked clean and white in the glare of my flashlight. A rib cage here, a femur there, smaller pieces I couldn't immediately identify. Some looked old, weathered by time. Others still had bits of tissue clinging to them. I moved deeper into the cave, stepping carefully around the scattered remains. My light swept across the walls and floor, revealing more bones with each step. This wasn't just one person. The sheer quantity of remains suggested multiple victims over an extended period. Against the far wall, I found the body. The man was face down, wearing hiking boots and a torn jacket that matched what I'd seen in the drone footage. Decomposition had started, but enough remained for me to see the extent of his injuries. Deep gouges ran across his back, consistent with claws rather than teeth. His limbs were twisted at unnatural angles. I forced myself to search his pockets, finding a wallet in his jeans. The leather was stained but intact. Inside, a driver's license identified him as Kyle Henderson, 32 years old, from the town about 12 miles away. The photo showed a young man with dark hair and a confident smile, the same face I'd seen screaming in terror on the memory card footage. The cave stretched further back than my flashlight could reach. I could see where it branched off into multiple passages, creating a network of tunnels that extended deep into the rock formation. The floor was covered with more bones than I wanted to count, some human, others that might have belonged to deer or other large animals. What caught my attention most was the construction against the far wall. Someone or something had built a nest using branches, leaves, and what looked like scraps of clothing. The arrangement was deliberate, purposeful, showing a level of intelligence that didn't belong to any animal I knew. Pieces of fabric were woven between the branches, a child's t-shirt, part of a hiking boot, strips of material I couldn't identify. The entire area reeked of death and that animal smell, but underneath was something else. Something that made every instinct I'd developed over 23 years in these woods scream danger. This place was wrong in ways that went beyond the obvious horror of scattered bones and rotting flesh. A sound echoed from deep within the cave system. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across stone, coming closer. I dropped the flashlight. The sound of it clattering against the cave floor mixed with those approaching footsteps, and every survival instinct I'd built over 23 years in these woods screamed the same message: run. I turned and bolted toward the cave entrance, leaving Kyle Henderson's body and all those scattered bones behind me in the darkness. Branches and brush tore at my jacket as I crashed through the camouflaged entrance. My rifle bounced against my back with each step, but I didn't slow down to adjust the strap. Behind me, something massive moved through the cave system. those deliberate footsteps now picking up pace. The sound echoed off stone walls and followed me into the forest. I ran harder than I'd run in decades, my boots finding purchase on familiar ground, even as panic clouded my thinking. These trails knew my feet, and muscle memory guided me around fallen logs and low-hanging branches that would have tripped up anyone else. The rifle stock caught on a pine bough and nearly sent me sprawling, but I yanked it free and kept moving. My lungs burned after the first quarter mile. The steady work of checking traps and maintaining my property had kept me in decent shape, but this was different. This was pure terror driving my legs forward, pushing me past the normal limits of a 50-year-old body that spent most of its time walking, not sprinting. The creek bed appeared ahead of me, and I splashed across without bothering to find the stepping stones I usually used. Cold water soaked through my boots and chilled my feet, but I barely noticed. Something roared behind me, deep and powerful enough to make birds explode from the trees in all directions. The sound didn't belong to any animal I'd ever heard. I changed direction twice on the way back, taking a longer route that led away from the main trail. If that thing was following me, I wanted to make it work for the privilege. My cabin sat in its clearing another mile ahead, and every step felt like it took forever. The forest around me had transformed from a familiar neighborhood into hostile territory filled with shadows that might hide something massive and hungry. 20 minutes after dropping that flashlight, I burst through my front door and immediately threw the deadbolt. My hand shook as I reached above the fireplace for my shotgun, a reliable 12-gauge I'd owned for 15 years. 2 shells were already loaded, with more ammunition in the cabinet beside my workbench. I moved from lamp to lamp, extinguishing each flame until my cabin sat in complete darkness. Only then did I approach the front window and peer out into the forest that had been my home for so long. Silence filled the air at first, just the normal evening sounds of settling wood and distant cricket songs. I pressed my face against the glass, trying to see past the first line of trees that bordered my clearing. The shotgun felt solid in my hands, but I knew it was designed for rabbits and birds, not whatever had built that nest from human clothing. Then I heard it. A low rumbling sound, like a diesel engine idling somewhere close by. The noise came from different directions as it moved, circling through the trees that surrounded my property. I'd never heard anything like it in all my years here. 2 red spots appeared between the pine trees on the eastern edge of my clearing. Eyes. Glowing red eyes that stood at least 8 feet off the ground, maybe higher. They moved with a fluid motion that suggested something large and powerful, but the footsteps made almost no sound despite the creature's obvious size. I watched those eyes drift from tree to tree, always keeping the clearing in sight. The creature circled my cabin with an intelligence that chilled me more than its size. This wasn't random animal behavior driven by hunger or territorial instinct. Those movements showed planning, evaluation, testing. It stayed in the tree line at first, observing my home from multiple angles like it was studying the structure for weaknesses. When it finally approached my front door, the entire cabin groaned. The sound came from the wooden frame settling under immense weight pressed against the other side of the door. I stepped back from the window and raised the shotgun, knowing the deadbolt wouldn't stop anything strong enough to make my walls creak like that. The weight shifted, and I heard scratching sounds as something explored the door's surface. Heavy footsteps moved around to the side of the cabin, and I followed the sound while staying well back from the windows. The creature tested each one, and through the glass I caught glimpses of massive claws scraping against the frames. Each claw looked longer than my fingers, curved and sharp enough to tear through wood without effort. At the back window, it paused for longer than the others. I crept closer and saw one enormous red eye peering through the glass, moving as it examined the interior of my cabin. The pupil was huge and black, surrounded by an iris that seemed to shift colors in the darkness. Recognition flashed across that alien intelligence when the eye focused on me standing in the shadows. We stared at each other for maybe 30 seconds. The eye blinked once, a slow, deliberate motion, then moved away from the window. The footsteps resumed their circuit around my home, but now they carried a different quality, more purposeful, more confident. For 3 hours it prowled around my property. Sometimes the red eyes would disappear completely, leaving me wondering if the creature had finally moved on. Then the diesel rumble would start up again, coming from a different direction, and I'd spot those glowing points moving between the trees. It tested my generator shed, and I heard metal groaning under pressure. Something crashed in the area where I kept my firewood, probably the creature investigating the neat stacks I'd built for winter. The sounds came from all around my cabin at different times, creating a pattern that felt like psychological warfare. I remained motionless in the center of my one room, shotgun ready, trying to track the creature's movements by sound alone. My legs cramped from standing in the same position for so long, but I didn't dare sit down or move to a different spot. The floorboards in my cabin were old and prone to creaking, and I had no idea how sensitive that thing's hearing might be. Around midnight, the sounds stopped completely. I waited another hour before moving to the window. The forest looked empty, just dark trees and normal shadows. No red eyes, no rumbling diesel sound, no weight testing my doors and windows. But I didn't trust the silence. Something that intelligent wouldn't give up easily, and I had no way of knowing if it was really gone or just waiting for me to make a mistake. I stayed awake until sunrise, clutching the shotgun and jumping at every small sound from outside. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through my windows, I finally allowed myself to believe the creature had moved on. But as I looked down at the 12 gauge in my hands, I understood with complete clarity that the small weapon would be useless against whatever was out there. 2 shells loaded with birdshot weren't going to stop something that could drag grown men through the forest and build nests from their clothing. I'd need something much more powerful, and I'd need help from people who had access to weapons designed for larger targets. I'd lived alone in these woods for over 2 decades, relying on my own skills and knowledge to handle every problem that came up. But this was beyond anything I could manage by myself. I sat in my kitchen chair until the forest sounds changed from the brittle quiet of pre-dawn to the busy chatter of morning birds. My hands had stopped shaking sometime around 4 in the morning, but the shotgun stayed across my knees until I could see every tree trunk clearly through the window glass. The creature had left tracks in the soft earth around my cabin. I found them when I finally worked up the nerve to step outside, massive paw prints that sank deep into the dirt near my front door. Each print measured longer than my hand, with claw marks extending several inches beyond the pad impressions. The spacing between prints suggested something that walked upright on its hind legs, covering distance with strides that would have required me to jog just to keep pace. Loading the memory card and both rifles into my pickup truck felt like admitting defeat. 23 years of self-reliance, of handling every problem that came up in these woods. And now I was driving to town to ask for help like some helpless city person who couldn't change a flat tire. But the alternative was sitting in my cabin waiting for that thing to come back with a better plan for getting inside. The drive took 40 minutes on winding back roads I rarely traveled. My truck knew the route to town from monthly supply runs, but months had passed since my last trip. The familiar weight of isolation lifted gradually as I passed mailboxes and driveways belonging to other people. Reminders that civilization existed beyond my forest boundaries. The sheriff's office occupied a small brick building on Main Street, sharing space with the volunteer fire department and town offices. Robert Mitchell had been sheriff for 8 years, though I'd only met him twice during my rare visits to town. He struck me as competent and level-headed, someone who took his job seriously without getting caught up in small-town politics. I found him behind a metal desk covered with paperwork, reading incident reports while nursing a cup of coffee that smelled like it had been brewing since yesterday. He looked up when I walked in, probably surprised to see me this far from my property. "Lucas, right? You're the one with the place out on Deer Creek Road." "That's right. I need to show you something." Robert studied my face for a moment, taking in whatever expression I was wearing after a sleepless night of terror. I probably looked exactly like someone who'd been stalked by a monster because his casual demeanor shifted immediately into something more focused. What kind of something? I pulled the memory card from my shirt pocket and set it on his desk. The tiny device looked insignificant, sitting next to his coffee mug and stack of reports, but I knew what images were stored on that little piece of plastic. I found a crashed drone on my property 3 days ago. This was inside it. Robert examined the card, turning it over in his fingers. You saying this has footage of something on your land? Yeah, something that's been killing people. His eyebrows went up at that, and he leaned back in his chair. I could see him deciding whether I was some kind of conspiracy theorist or if this warranted serious attention. The memory card wasn't much to look at, but something in my voice must have convinced him to take it seriously. Let me see what we're dealing with. He had better equipment than my improvised radio setup, a computer with proper connections for viewing digital files. The same images that had been grainy and compressed on my small screen appeared in full resolution on his monitor. The sequence played out exactly as I remembered it. The dragging, the terrified face, that massive eye staring directly into the camera. Robert watched the footage 3 times without saying a word. His expression grew more serious with each viewing, and by the 3rd time through, he was leaning forward with his elbows on the desk, studying every detail. Where did you say you found this drone? Caught in an oak tree about half a mile from my cabin, crashed hard enough to bend the propellers and crack the body. And this footage is from your property? Recognize the terrain. I've been walking those woods for over 20 years. Robert picked up his phone and dialed an extension. James, William, I need you both in here right now. The 2 deputies arrived within minutes. James Peterson was younger, maybe early 30s, with the eager attitude of someone who still found police work exciting. William Garcia looked more experienced, the kind of cop who'd seen enough to stay calm during unusual situations. Robert played the footage for them without explanation, letting them draw their own conclusions. Both deputies watched with the same progression of expressions I'd probably worn: confusion, recognition, and growing alarm as the implications became clear. Jesus Christ, James muttered when the massive eye filled the screen. What the hell is that thing? Something living on Lucas's property, Robert said. Something that's been hunting people. William studied the screen more carefully. This victim look familiar to either of you? Young guy, dark hair, hiking clothes. Could be that Henderson kid who went missing last month, James suggested. Family reported him overdue from a camping trip. Kyle Henderson, Robert confirmed, checking his files. 32 years old, experienced hiker. Disappeared somewhere around Bear Mountain area. I felt my stomach drop. Bear Mountain bordered my property to the east, and the creek bed where I'd found the blood trail ran directly from that direction. Kyle Henderson had been missing for a month, which meant he'd been dead in that cave for weeks before I discovered his body. There's more, I said. I found where it's been taking them. Robert assembled the hunting party within an hour. Besides the 3 of us, he recruited Tommy Morrison, who ran the local gun shop and knew how to handle serious firepower. Frank Chen owned a small ranch outside town and had military experience from his army days. Dave Rodriguez worked construction and possessed the kind of steady nerves you needed for dangerous jobs. All 6 of us carried high-powered rifles suitable for large game. Robert brought a .308 Winchester, while I carried my .30-30 and backup shotgun. The others had similar equipment, serious weapons designed to stop something much bigger than deer or rabbits. The drive back to my property felt different, with 5 other men following behind me in their vehicles. For months, that winding road had been my private route home, traveled only by me and the occasional delivery truck. Now it served as a path to something I'd never wanted to share with anyone. I led them along the creek bed to where I'd found the blood trail, pointing out the disturbed earth and dark stains that marked Kyle Henderson's final journey. The signs looked even more obvious with fresh eyes examining them, creating a clear path from the water's edge to the hidden cave entrance. Robert radioed our position to dispatch before we approached the cave. Unit 7 at Deer Creek location, investigating missing person report. 6-man team entering cave system for search and recovery. The response crackled back through static. Copy Unit 7. Backup on standby if needed. We moved the camouflaging brush away from the cave entrance as a group, revealing the opening that had stayed hidden for years. The same metallic smell of blood and decay rolled out to greet us, but now it seemed stronger, more concentrated than when I'd been here alone. Frank Chen produced powerful LED flashlights for everyone, much better than the small light I'd dropped during my panicked escape. The beams cut through the darkness and revealed details I'd missed in my brief previous visit. Human bones covered the cave floor in much greater quantities than I'd initially seen. Skulls, femurs, rib cages, smaller pieces scattered across the stone surface like some macabre museum display. The flashlight beams picked out at least 5 different skulls, suggesting multiple victims over an extended period. "How long has this been going on?" William asked, his voice echoing off the cave walls. "Hard to say," Robert replied, kneeling beside one of the skulls. "Some of these bones look old, weathered. Others are fresher." James found a driver's license tucked into the remains of a wallet near the back wall. The plastic had been chewed and scratched, but the information was still readable. "Marcus Webb, age 28, he announced. "Reported missing 3 weeks ago. Family said he was hiking the Appalachian Trail section that runs through this area." "That's 2 positive IDs," Robert said grimly. "Kyle Henderson and Marcus Webb. Both experienced hikers who knew what they were doing in the woods." William discovered camping equipment scattered throughout the cave. A torn backpack, a sleeping bag reduced to shreds, a cell phone with a spider web of cracks across the screen. The items had been arranged in that nest-like structure I'd noticed before, woven together with pieces of clothing and strips of fabric. "Look at this construction," Frank observed, examining the nest more closely. "This isn't random. Something built this deliberately." The cave system extended much deeper than my brief exploration had revealed. Multiple tunnels branched off from the main chamber, disappearing into darkness that our flashlights couldn't penetrate. Some passages angled downward, while others curved upward into the rock formation. The entire network could have stretched for hundreds of yards underground. "We need better equipment," Robert decided after we documented the scene with his camera. "Rope, more lights, maybe some protective gear. This is bigger than what we came prepared for." Tommy Morrison nodded toward the tunnel openings. "Could be more victims deeper in there, or more of whatever's been doing this." "We'll come back tomorrow with proper cave exploration gear," Robert said. "Tonight we'll set up a perimeter and see if we can catch this thing when it returns." The plan made sense from a tactical standpoint, but something about the cave's atmosphere made me nervous about staying longer than necessary. The walls seemed to press inward, and that animal smell grew stronger the longer we remained in the confined space. We started gathering our equipment and preparing to leave, when a sound echoed from somewhere deep within the tunnel system. A roar that started low and built to an earth-shaking bellow, powerful enough to make loose stones fall from the ceiling. All 6 of us froze, rifles raised, as the roar continued to build and change, taking on qualities that no animal should possess. The sound hit us like a physical force, vibrations traveling through the stone floor and up into our boots. All 6 rifles swung toward the tunnel openings, but the roar seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off cave walls and multiplying into something that made my teeth ache. "Back to the entrance," Robert ordered, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Now." We moved as a group toward the mouth of the cave, but the creature was already ahead of us. A massive shape emerged from a side passage I hadn't even noticed during our exploration. A narrow opening hidden behind fallen rocks that must have connected to the main tunnel system. The thing that stepped into our flashlight beams made every rational thought in my head shut down completely. It stood nearly 10 feet tall, but the proportions were all wrong for anything that should exist in nature. The basic shape resembled a bear. If you could imagine a bear stretched and distorted by some nightmare process that added 3 feet of height and changed everything else. The limbs were too long, joints bending at angles that hurt to look at. Those red eyes from the memory card footage now blazed in the LED light. Each one the size of a dinner plate and filled with an intelligence that no animal should possess. The claws extended from its front paws like curved daggers, each one longer than my hand and sharp enough to carve through stone. But it was the mouth that made my stomach drop. Rows of teeth that belonged in a shark's jaw, not on any land animal. The creature's muzzle had elongated beyond normal bear proportions, creating space for those extra rows of razors that gleamed wet in our lights. James raised his rifle first, but the creature moved with speed that defied its massive size. One swipe of those knife-like claws opened him from shoulder to waist, tearing through his jacket, shirt, and skin like they were made of paper. Blood sprayed across the cave wall as James went down without even crying out, his rifle clattering away across the stone floor. The attack happened so fast that my brain needed several seconds to process what I'd witnessed. James had been standing beside me, ready to fire, and now he was on the ground in a spreading pool of blood while the creature loomed over him with claws dripping red. Robert and William opened fire at the same time, their rifles booming in the confined space. The muzzle flashes lit up the cave like strobe lights, and I could see their bullets hitting the creature's torso, punching dark holes in its fur. But instead of dropping or even staggering, the thing just turned its attention toward them with what looked like annoyed curiosity. William got off 3 shots before the creature reached him. Those massive claws wrapped around his chest and lifted him clear off the ground, then hurled him against the cave wall with a wet thudding sound that I knew meant broken bones. William hit the stone and crumpled, his rifle spinning away into the darkness. "Tommy! Frank!" Robert shouted. But when I spun around to look for the other hunters, I saw 2 shapes already running for the cave entrance. Tommy Morrison dropped his rifle and sprinted toward daylight without looking back. Dave Rodriguez was right behind him, abandoning his weapon and stumbling over scattered bones in his panic to escape. That left 3 of us against something that had just demonstrated our bullets were little more than irritating pinpricks. Robert was already reloading, his hands steady despite the chaos, while I fumbled with my .30-30 and tried to find a target that might actually matter. The creature turned back toward Robert, and I could see intelligence calculating behind those red eyes. It was learning from our attack, figuring out which of us posed the greatest threat. Robert raised his reloaded rifle and fired again, this time aiming for the head instead of the body. The bullet caught the creature just below its left eye, snapping its head back and finally drawing a reaction that suggested we'd actually hurt it. Dark blood, almost black in the LED beams, ran down the side of its muzzle. The thing roared again, but this time the sound carried pain along with rage. Robert kept firing, working the bolt on his .308 and putting rounds into the creature's face and neck. I joined him, my .30-30 adding its smaller voice to the barrage. The combined gunfire drove the creature backward toward the tunnel openings, though whether from actual damage or simple annoyance, I couldn't tell. After Robert's rifle clicked empty, the creature took one more look at us with those massive red eyes, then turned and melted back into the passage it had emerged from. The sound of its footsteps receded into the depths of the cave system, leaving us in sudden silence, broken only by our own harsh breathing. William was still alive, but barely conscious when we reached him. Blood ran from his ears and nose, and his left arm bent at an angle that made me look away. James never moved from where he'd fallen, the pool of blood around him spreading across the uneven stone floor. "Help me get William out of here," Robert said, slinging his empty rifle and grabbing William under the arms. "We need to move before that thing decides to come back." I took William's legs, trying not to think about the grinding sound his ribs made when we lifted him. He groaned once, a weak sound that barely qualified as human. The walk back to the cave entrance felt like it took hours, though it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. Every shadow behind us might have hidden those red eyes, Every sound could have been claws on stone. Tommy and Dave were waiting by their trucks, engines already running. Tommy looked pale and shaken, his hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him from flying apart. "James," Dave called out as we emerged from the cave. Robert shook his head. "Dead. William needs a hospital right now." We loaded William into the back seat of Robert's patrol car, and I climbed in beside him to keep pressure on the worst of his wounds. The drive to County General became a nightmare of winding back roads taken at dangerous speeds, while William's breathing grew more shallow with each mile. The roaring from the cave followed us even after we'd driven out of hearing range. I kept expecting to see those red eyes in the rear window, watching us flee like the cowards we'd become. William died 3 miles before we reached the hospital. I felt the life go out of him somewhere on Route 9, his breathing just stopping between one ragged gasp and the next. Robert kept driving anyway, maybe hoping the doctors could bring him back, or maybe just because stopping meant admitting we'd failed completely. The emergency room staff took William's body and asked the questions you'd expect. What happened? How did he get these injuries? Were there any witnesses? Robert handled the paperwork while I sat in a plastic chair and stared at my hands, still sticky with William's blood. Robert made his call to the state police from a payphone outside the hospital. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I watched his face grow more serious as he talked. When he hung up, he walked back over to where I was sitting and dropped into the chair beside me. "They're sending someone," he said. "Should be here within the hour." "Someone from the state police?" Robert looked tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. "No, someone else." We waited in that hospital parking lot for 2 hours before the first military vehicle arrived. Not state police, not federal agents, but actual Army personnel in camouflage uniforms who spoke to Robert in quiet voices and asked very specific questions about what we'd encountered in the cave. A colonel named Thomas Wright introduced himself and explained that our situation wasn't as unique as we'd assumed. Similar incidents had occurred in remote areas across 3 states over the past 18 months. The military had been tracking what they called anomalous biological entities using satellite surveillance and field reports from local law enforcement. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened," Colonel Wright told us as more military vehicles arrived. "And unfortunately, it probably won't be the last." The words hit me harder than the creature's roar had. All those years living alone in my peaceful woods, believing I understood every danger these forests could hold. And now I learned that monsters like this existed in multiple locations. Other people had faced those red eyes and those knife-like claws. Other hunters had watched their friends die in caves filled with human bones. I thought about James lying motionless in that spreading pool of blood, and William's life leaving him on a back road 3 miles from help. 2 good men dead because we'd walked into something that was supposed to be impossible. Military helicopters appeared on the horizon as the sun began to set, their rotor noise cutting through the evening air like mechanical thunder. Colonel Wright received radio updates every few minutes, coordinating an operation that had apparently been planned long before we'd ever found that crashed drone. "You'll need to come with us," the colonel informed Robert and me. "For your own safety and for debriefing. There are procedures we follow in situations like this." As we climbed into the back of an olive green truck, I realized my days of living alone in the forest had ended permanently. Whatever was happening in those woods involved forces much larger than one creature and one cave system. The military response, the satellite tracking, the multiple incidents across 3 states. It all pointed to something that had been growing and spreading while people like me assumed we were safe in our remote locations. The truck pulled away from the hospital, heading toward a future I couldn't predict, and carrying me away from the only life I'd ever known. The military truck carried us through town to the community center, a brick building I'd driven past hundreds of times without ever going inside. Colonel Wright sat across from Robert and me, speaking quietly into a radio headset while giving instructions I couldn't fully understand. His voice carried the clipped efficiency of someone accustomed to coordinating dangerous operations on short notice. 2 more trucks followed behind us, filled with soldiers in full combat gear carrying weapons much more serious than our hunting rifles. Through the rear window, I watched them checking equipment and studying maps while the convoy moved through streets that looked strange with military vehicles parked along the curbs. Above us, helicopters maintained a steady orbit around the forest boundaries. The mechanical thunder of rotor blades created a constant background noise that seemed to press down on the entire town. I counted at least 4 aircraft, though more appeared on the horizon every few minutes, arriving from directions that suggested military bases I'd never known existed this close to our rural area. The community center's main hall had been converted into some kind of command post. Folding tables held communications equipment, maps covered in red markings, and computer screens displaying information I couldn't interpret. Soldiers moved between workstations with practiced coordination, their conversations filled with military terminology that sounded like a foreign language. Wright led us to a smaller room off the main hall, closing the door behind us and activating some kind of electronic device that produced a low humming sound. He explained this would prevent our conversation from being overheard or recorded, a precaution that made the serious nature of our situation even clearer. "What you encountered tonight isn't an isolated incident," Wright began, spreading photographs across the table between us. "We've been tracking similar entities for the past 18 months across Virginia, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania." The photographs showed creatures that resembled what we'd faced in the cave, but each one displayed slightly different characteristics. Some appeared more bear-like, others had elongated limbs that suggested primate ancestry. All of them shared those same oversized red eyes and the wrong proportions that made them look like nature's mistakes. "Anomalous biological entities," Wright continued. "That's our official designation. We believe they're mutations of existing wildlife, though we haven't determined the exact cause yet. Environmental factors, possibly genetic manipulation, or something else entirely." Robert studied the photographs more carefully than I could manage. The images brought back too many details from our cave encounter. Those knife-like claws, the intelligent calculation in those red eyes, the speed that had allowed the creature to kill James before any of us could react effectively. "How many?" Robert asked. "Confirmed encounters in 17 locations. We've eliminated 12 entities, but 5 others disappeared before we could engage them. The one in your forest was actually our primary target. We'd been tracking it through satellite surveillance for 3 weeks." Wright pulled out additional photographs showing aerial views of cave systems, forest clearings, and what appeared to be military cleanup operations. Soldiers in hazmat suits worked around burned areas that had once been caves or underground lairs. Each entity appears to establish a territory, usually centered around a cave system or similar defensible location. They hunt systematically, dragging victims back to their lairs for consumption. The intelligence level varies, but all of them show planning capabilities beyond normal wildlife. The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder outside, joined by the distant rumble of heavier aircraft arriving. Through the small window in our meeting room, I could see military vehicles establishing checkpoints at every road leading out of town. Whatever operation was about to begin, they intended to contain it completely. "Your forest is currently surrounded by 3 companies of infantry," Wright explained. "Attack helicopters are maintaining aerial surveillance, and specialized teams are moving into position for a coordinated assault on the cave system." As if responding to his words, the first sounds of gunfire began echoing from the direction of my property. Not the sharp cracks of hunting rifles, but the sustained hammering of automatic weapons designed for military combat. The noise carried clearly through the community center walls, a mechanical drumbeat that continued without pause for several minutes. Robert moved to the window, peering out at the forest where flashes of light began appearing between the trees. Muzzle flashes from heavy weapons illuminated the darkness in rapid strobes, creating a light show that looked nothing like any hunting expedition I'd ever witnessed. "Machine guns," Wright confirmed. .50 caliber weapons mounted on the helicopters. We're saturating the entire cave area with suppressive fire while ground teams advance through the tunnel system. The gunfire continued for over an hour, punctuated by explosions that rattled the community center windows. Each blast was followed by radio chatter as Wright received updates from field commanders coordinating the assault. I caught fragments of the reports. Contact confirmed, target engaging, casualties reported. But the military jargon made it difficult to understand exactly what was happening in my woods. A series of smaller explosions began around midnight, creating orange flashes that painted the forest in brief moments of hellish illumination. Wright explained these were grenades being used to clear individual tunnel sections, a methodical process of destroying the entire underground network where the creature had been living. Flamethrowers, he added when the orange light persisted longer than the grenade flashes. We're burning out every passage to ensure nothing survives. I found myself thinking about the bones we'd seen scattered across the cave floor, the remains of Kyle Henderson and Marcus Webb and others whose names we'd never learned. Those men had hiked into my peaceful forest expecting nothing more dangerous than bears or maybe coyotes, never imagining they would become food for something that shouldn't exist. The tempo of gunfire increased around 2 a.m, joined by the deeper boom of larger weapons that made the entire building shake. Through the radio chatter, I gathered that the creature had finally engaged the military teams directly, instead of hiding in the tunnel depths. Wright's expression remained professional, but I noticed his hands tightening on the radio handset as reports came in describing casualties among his soldiers. 3 confirmed dead, 2 more wounded seriously enough to require immediate medical evacuation. The creature was fighting back with the same lethal efficiency it had demonstrated against James and William. At exactly 3 o'clock, an explosion powerful enough to crack plaster in our meeting room shook the community center so violently that books fell from shelves in the main hall. The blast wave rattled every window in the building and set off car alarms throughout the downtown area. "Hellfire missile," Wright said calmly, though I could see relief in his face when the radio confirmed the direct hit. Fired from an Apache helicopter at point-blank range into the main cave chamber. The gunfire stopped immediately after that massive explosion, replaced by an eerie silence that felt almost as unsettling as the combat noise had been. For 2 hours, Wright received status reports from teams moving through the destroyed cave system, confirming that the creature had been killed and documenting the complete destruction of its underground lair. Dawn brought a different kind of activity to the forest. Heavy machinery arrived on flatbed trucks, followed by crews in hazmat suits, who began the process of removing what Wright diplomatically called biological remains. Through binoculars, I could see soldiers loading body parts into sealed containers, while other teams used flamethrowers to sterilize every surface of the collapsed cave system. "Standard cleanup protocol," Wright explained when he noticed me watching. "We remove all trace evidence and seal the site with concrete. The official report will describe a tragic bear attack that killed 2 local hunters during a cave exploration." He showed me additional photographs then, images that made my understanding of the situation expand beyond anything I'd imagined. Similar cleanup operations in other states, creatures that had been eliminated in forests, abandoned mines, and remote mountain areas. Each incident had been covered up as animal attacks, industrial accidents, or natural disasters. "This has been happening for years," I said, more statement than question. 18 months of confirmed activity, though there are reports going back further that we're still investigating. Something is causing these mutations in isolated wildlife populations. We don't know if it's environmental contamination, biological weapons testing gone wrong, or something else entirely. Wright's radio crackled with a final status report. All biological material had been collected and removed. The cave system had been filled with quick-setting concrete. Burn teams had sterilized a quarter-mile radius around the site. The operation was complete. "The families of the victims will receive their loved ones' remains for proper burial," Wright said, closing the file of photographs. Kyle Henderson and the others deserve that much dignity. He leaned back in his chair and studied both Robert and me with the calculating look of someone making important decisions about our immediate future. What you witnessed tonight is classified at the highest levels of national security. The creatures, the military response, the cleanup operation. None of it can ever be discussed outside this room. Wright's tone remained conversational, but something in his expression made clear this wasn't a request. People who violate that security classification face federal charges that carry decades in prison. More importantly, anyone they tell becomes a security risk that requires permanent resolution. The threat was delivered with the same professional calm he'd used to describe military operations, but the meaning was unmistakable. Talking about what we'd seen would result in consequences for us and anyone we spoke to. Robert nodded his understanding, his face showing the exhaustion of someone who'd aged years in a single night. I found myself thinking about my peaceful cabin, my routine of checking snares and chopping wood, the simple life that had been destroyed by a crashed drone and the footage it contained. Outside, the helicopters were departing one by one, their mission completed. By full daylight, no trace would remain of the military operation except for some disturbed earth and a concrete-sealed cave that would eventually be forgotten by everyone except those of us who had witnessed what really happened. Wright gathered his photographs and stood to leave, pausing at the door to deliver one final piece of information. We'll be monitoring this area for the next several months to ensure no additional entities appear. For your own safety, I'd recommend avoiding extended time alone in remote forest areas. The words hit me like a physical blow. My home, my life, the forest that had been my sanctuary for over 2 decades, all of it was now officially too dangerous for the person who knew it better than anyone else. As Wright left us alone in the meeting room, I realized that the creature hadn't been the only casualty of this night's events. The life I'd built in those woods was just as dead as the monster they'd incinerated with rockets and flamethrowers. I pulled my truck into the familiar dirt driveway 3 days after the helicopters stopped circling. The engine shut off with its usual reluctant shudder, but everything else about coming home felt wrong in ways I couldn't name yet. 2 military jeeps sat parked along the main road near my property line, their olive paint jobs and radio antennas making it clear the operation wasn't finished. Men in camouflage uniforms moved between the trees, carrying equipment I didn't recognize and speaking into headsets with the same clipped efficiency Colonel Wright had demonstrated. The woods looked different now, not just because of the yellow tape strung between pine trees and the biohazard warning signs nailed to trunks I'd climbed as handholds for years. Something fundamental had changed in the way shadows fell across familiar paths, the way silence felt heavy instead of peaceful between bird calls. I grabbed my rifle from the passenger seat and walked toward my cabin, noting fresh tire tracks in the soft earth where heavy vehicles had driven through areas that had never seen anything larger than my pickup. The clearing around my home showed boot prints from multiple people, though I couldn't tell if they belonged to cleanup crews or soldiers maintaining the perimeter. My front door stood exactly as I'd left it, deadbolt thrown and spare key still hidden under the loose board on the porch steps. But stepping inside felt like entering someone else's house. The familiar arrangement of furniture and tools looked foreign, as if the past 3 days had stretched into months of absence. I set the rifle above the fireplace and moved through my single room, checking that everything remained in its proper place. Oil lamps sat on their usual shelves, generator parts organized in neat rows across my workbench, radio equipment undisturbed beside the window. Nothing had been moved or disturbed, yet the space felt contaminated by knowledge of what had been living less than a mile away. The memory card from the crashed drone still sat in my shirt pocket, though I'd shown its contents to enough people that keeping it served no practical purpose. Wright's people had probably made copies for their files, adding those horrible images to whatever collection of evidence they maintained about creatures that weren't supposed to exist. I tried to fall back into the routines that had structured my life for over 2 decades. Walking the trap lines should have felt automatic, my feet finding the worn paths without conscious thought. Instead, I found myself stopping every few yards to scan the tree line, searching for red eyes that might be watching from shadows that had never seemed threatening before. The snares hung empty, which made perfect sense given the military operation had filled these woods with gunfire and explosions for hours. Any normal wildlife would have fled miles away from that kind of disturbance. But checking each trap became an exercise in fighting paranoia as my mind turned every movement in my peripheral vision into potential threats. Half the traps needed relocation anyway. Soldiers had walked through areas where I'd placed them, their heavy boots disturbing the subtle arrangements of brush and bait that had taken years to perfect. Equipment that had been carefully positioned now lay scattered or broken, casualties of an operation that had necessarily prioritized elimination over preservation of my small hunting setup. Working in my garden behind the cabin proved equally unsettling. The simple task of pulling weeds and checking the progress of late summer vegetables should have provided the meditative focus that had always helped clear my mind. Instead, I spent more time watching the forest edge than examining my tomato plants, convinced something was observing me from the trees. Every sound triggered immediate alertness, branches creaking in wind, squirrels jumping between trees, even my own footsteps on familiar ground. The forest had become a source of constant low-level anxiety rather than the peaceful sanctuary it had been for most of my adult life. I found myself gripping tools more tightly than necessary, and jumping at shadows that resolved into nothing more threatening than swaying pine boughs. Chopping firewood became an ordeal of stopping to listen after every few swings of the axe. The rhythmic thudding that had always provided satisfying physical work now felt like announcing my location to anything that might be hunting in the area. My pile of split logs grew slowly as I divided my attention between the wood and constant surveillance of my surroundings. 3 times during that first day back, military personnel appeared at the edge of my clearing to check on my welfare. Professional soldiers with serious expressions who asked careful questions about whether I'd seen or heard anything unusual since returning home. Their presence felt both reassuring and deeply disturbing, a reminder that my peaceful isolation had been permanently shattered. That first night back proved the worst part of attempting to resume normal life. I lay in my bed with the shotgun within arm's reach, listening to every sound the old cabin made as wood settled and wind moved through the clearing. Normal house noises that had provided comfortable background sound for years now seemed potentially ominous, each creak and groan requiring investigation. The nightmare came around 3 a.m, vivid and specific in ways that made sleep impossible for the rest of the night. Those massive red eyes pressed against my window, patient and intelligent as they studied the interior of my home. In the dream, I could hear claws scraping against glass and feel the creature's weight testing the cabin's walls, searching for weaknesses with the same calculating method it had shown during our actual encounter. I woke with my heart racing and immediately checked every window in the cabin, flashlight beams sweeping across the clearing for any sign of movement. Nothing appeared except familiar trees and normal shadows, but the sense of being watched persisted until dawn finally provided enough light to see clearly in all directions. Local radio news carried the story exactly as Wright had predicted. 2 hunters killed in a tragic bear attack while exploring a remote cave system near Bear Mountain. James Peterson and William Garcia identified as victims of what wildlife officials called an unusually aggressive black bear that had been eliminated by state authorities. Kyle Henderson's name appeared in a separate story about the recovery of remains from a hiking accident weeks earlier. Kyle Henderson's funeral took place on a rainy Thursday morning in the town where he'd lived. I watched from my truck as family members and friends gathered around a casket that contained whatever remains Wright's people had recovered from the cave system. His parents looked exactly like the photos in his wallet. Decent people grieving for a son who died in ways they would never understand. 2 weeks of sleepless nights and constant anxiety finally broke down my stubborn determination to maintain life in these woods. Every sunset brought renewed dread about what might emerge from the forest after dark. Every sound outside my cabin required armed investigation. Every trip beyond my clearing felt like venturing into hostile territory where death could be watching from any direction. The accumulated stress left me exhausted and paranoid in ways that made normal activities feel impossible. Checking trap lines became exercises in terror rather than routine maintenance. Working in my garden turned into brief ventures outside, followed by quick retreats to the relative safety of my cabin. Even sitting on my porch to watch sunset, something I'd done thousands of times, now felt recklessly exposed. I started making lists of essential belongings, telling myself it was just preparation for an extended trip somewhere else. A temporary change of scenery to clear my head and recover from the trauma of recent events. But deep down, I understood these lists represented the beginning of permanent departure from the only home I'd ever truly loved. The decision crystallized on a Tuesday morning when I discovered fresh gouges in the bark of the oak tree beside my cabin. 4 parallel scratches, too high and too deep to have been made by any normal animal, carved into wood with the same precise spacing as the claws I'd seen in that cave. Whether left by the dead creature during its stalking or by something else entirely, the marks proved my woods were no longer safe for human habitation. I loaded my truck methodically, taking only what could fit in the bed and cab. Rifles wrapped in blankets, ammunition boxes secured with rope, my radio equipment protected in waterproof containers. Clothing, tools, and camping gear filled every available space, leaving behind furniture and larger items that belonged to a life I was abandoning. The photograph from my father sat on the dashboard, the only personal item I couldn't leave behind. 23 years of accumulated possessions reduced to what would fit in a pickup truck, with everything else remaining as a monument to the peaceful existence that had ended the night I found that crashed drone. Walking through my cabin one final time, I tried to memorize details that had provided comfort and stability for over 2 decades. The workbench where I'd maintained equipment and repaired everything that broke. The fireplace that had heated this single room through countless winter nights. The window where I'd watched deer graze in the clearing during quiet summer evenings. Each familiar object and surface carried memories of the man I'd been before learning that monsters existed in these woods. A simpler person who believed the greatest dangers came from weather, equipment failures, and normal wildlife that could be understood and predicted. That version of myself had died alongside James and William in a cave filled with human bones. I closed the cabin door without locking it. Someone else could decide what to do with the building and remaining contents. My part in this place had ended the moment I realized home could become a hunting ground for things that shouldn't exist in nature. The truck started on the second try, engine turning over with its familiar rough idle. I backed out of the driveway and pointed toward the main road, forcing myself not to look in the mirrors as the cabin disappeared behind trees. The forest that had shaped every day of my adult life fell away mile by mile, replaced by farmland and small towns that had never seemed important before. Driving away felt like losing my identity along with my home. These woods had defined who I was, a self-reliant man who understood wilderness and lived comfortably apart from civilization's complications. Without that foundation, I became just another person searching for somewhere to belong, in a world that had grown infinitely more dangerous. The radio played country music as I drove, songs about home and belonging that felt like they were written in a language I no longer spoke. I turned the volume down and focused on the road ahead, mile markers counting distance from everything I'd ever known toward whatever came next. But even as I put the cursed woods behind me, Wright's words echoed in my memory. Similar incidents in multiple states, creatures tracked by satellite surveillance, an ongoing threat that was spreading rather than contained. Finding somewhere new to start over might provide temporary peace, but the knowledge of what existed in remote areas would follow me anywhere I tried to rebuild. I wondered if true safety was even possible anymore, knowing that monsters could be lurking in any isolated forest. any cave system, any wilderness area where people ventured alone. The paranoia that had made my own woods unlivable might prove to be the only rational response to a world where childhood nightmares had become deadly reality. The highway stretched ahead through rolling hills and distant mountains, leading toward an uncertain future in places I'd never seen. Behind me, the woods that had been my sanctuary remained contaminated by horror, sealed caves, and memories that would never fade. Somewhere ahead lay the possibility of peace, though I doubted I would ever feel truly safe again.